Chapter 14 The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. Color and Consistency. How, it may be asked, can one be sure that it was one particular member of the fungus species that was the subject of the sacred mushroom cult? Even the canopied Boletus type offers a wide range of specimens, and more than one kind of this variety has in its cap a hallucinatory drug. The answer is that the sacred mushroom was characterized in the name and mythology by its distinctive coloring, the deep red of the cap contrasting with the white stem, and with the white or yellowish warts standing out against the red, remnants of the broken vulva from which it grew. In the following chapter, we shall look at the names deriving from the color and scabby form of the Amanita muscaria, and how its distinctive appearance contributed in no small measure to the awesome wonder with which its worshippers regarded the fungus, and the stories woven around it. The fleecy cloak. The color characteristics of the sacred mushroom provided folklore with a number of day-to-day allusions, among them being that the red top flecked with the white particles seemed like a red woolen cloak or fleece. The most famous of all classical myths derived from this characteristic is the story of the quest for the Golden Fleece by Jason and the Argonauts. By golden, in this context, we have to think of the red gold most common in the ancient world, rather than the purer yellow metal of modern jewelry. The story runs as follows. Phrixus and Helle, the two children of the Boeotian king Athamas, were hated by their stepmother, Mo. Their lives were threatened, and Hermes gave them a fabulous ram on which they fled to safety. The ram had a fleece of gold, and could fly as well as reason and speak. The two children climbed onto its back and flew off. Helle fell off as they crossed the sea named after her, Hellespont, Helle's Sea. But Phrixus managed to remain aboard until they reached Colchis on the Black Sea. The unfortunate ram was then sacrificed, and its wonderful fleece offered to the king of that country, Aeetes, who hung it on a tree and set a dragon to guard it night and day. Meanwhile, at Loeches, in Thessaly, one Jason, attempting to win back part of his rightful heritage of the kingdom from his wicked uncle Peleus, was set the task of finding and bringing back the Golden Fleece. And with the help of Hera and Athene, he built a 50-oared ship called the Argo, in which he had set a bow of the prophetic oak of Zeus at Dodona. And among his heroic crew were the Dioscuri, setting the mushroom seal firmly upon the myth. And after many adventures, the Argonauts managed to lull the dragon and seize the fleece and make good their escape. And with the help of the king's daughter, Medea, who went with them, she married Jason, and they lived happily for 10 years before the hero fell in love with another and abandoned Medea. She avenged herself by sending the new bride a costly robe, which immediately it was put on, consumed her with inextinguishable fire. The ram was a prime symbol of fecundity in the ancient world, but this story illustrates another of its virtues. Its hair was of great importance for weaving outer garments and tent cloths. And in Sumerian, the same word, dara, is used of the animal and for hair dyed red. And when the latter significance was required, a detrimentive sig, hair, could be put before the word. And from the reversed combination dara sig, the Greeks obtained their word for hair, generally thrix, through tragius. Properly, it meant red hair, and it is probably with this sense that a similarly derived word, thrakios, is used of the people of Thrace, the Thracians, the red-headed people. Dionysus was a Thracian god, and his frantic Medias were called the Thracia. But the reference here is probably not primarily to the homeland of the cult, but to the red-cloaked, Amanita muscaria, that sent them berserk. This may have been what Josephus had in mind in a particular reference to the Jewish priest king Alexander Jannaeus. And following an abortive revolt by his Jewish subjects against him, the king is said to have crucified 800 of his subjects in Jerusalem, about the year 83 BC. So, says Josephus, the people called him a Thracian. This may have been an allusion to a suspicion that he was an eater of the sacred mushroom himself, or to the popular imagery that linked the mushroom with the cross of crucifixion. It would seem from one of the names given by Dioscorides to the mandrake that it was also called by the name Thracian. It would be interesting to know if the people of Thrace, apart from their religious interest in the red-haired Amanita muscaria, were themselves red-headed, as their name implies. And certainly they were famed for their viciousness on the field of battle. And it is interesting that the idea that the associates red-headed people with quick tempers persists even to this day. And in the Old Testament, the story of how the crafty, smooth-skinned Jacob managed to trick his red, rough-skinned brother, Esau, out of his birthright is another presentation of the red-cloaked mushroom theme in mythology. But Jacob said to Rebekah, his mother, "Behold, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him, and bring a curse upon myself, and not a blessing." And his mother said to him, "Upon me be your curse, my son. Only obey my word and go. Fetch them, the kids, to me." So he went and took them and brought them to his mother, and his mother prepared savory food, such as his father loved. Then Rebekah took the best garments of Esau, her older son, which were with her in the house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son, and the skins of the kids she put on his hands and upon the smooth part of his neck. And she gave the savory food and the bread, which she had prepared, into the hand of her son Jacob. So he went in to his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am. Who are you, my son?" And Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn." And then Isaac said, "Come near, that I may feel you, my son, to know whether you are really my son Esau or not." So Jacob went near to Isaac his father, who felt him and said, "The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau." And he did not recognize him, because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's handy hands. Esau's name, as we now recognize from the Sumerian Ashua, raised canopy, a fitting epithet for one who represented in mythical form the cap of the Amanita muscaria, and his brother Jacob, Sumerian for pillar, was the mushroom stem. The redness of his skin is remarked upon in the story of the twins' birth. And Isaac prayed to Yahweh for his wife, because she was barren, and Yahweh granted his prayer, and Rebekah his wife conceived. And the children struggled within her, and she said, "If it be thus, why do I live?" So she went to inquire of Yahweh, and Yahweh said to her, "Two nations are in thy womb, and two peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger." And when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. And the first came forth all red, all his body like a hairy mantle. So they called his name Esau. So striking was the color of the cap of the Amanita muscaria that it gave its name to red or purple dyes in the ancient world. And of such was the Greek phoenix, name of the palm tree, the bird, and the Levantine coast, as well as famous purple dye. As we shall see, the Greek word was derived from a Sumerian phrase, mighty man holding up the sky, a fanciful descriptive epithet of the mushroom. The Latin tablion, also denoting the purple fringe of authority, derives also from the Sumerian tab ba li, literally double cone or cup, being the two halves of the split mushroom vulva. Of particular interest for our study is the Sumerian word gan nu, used of the red dye cochineal. This also derives very probably from the red top of the Amanita muscaria, since gan is also means a cone or hemispherical shape, such as the lid of a bowl or a woman's breast. It is from this latter use in the fuller Sumerian phrase, agon, breast, that Greek obtained its name for the mushroom, amanita, properly the breast-shaped object, referring to the cap. And from the Sumerian gan-nu, denoting the red dye, came the Hebrew word kujun for the red cap or daub, put as protection on the head of the ewes in pasture. Such a red cap well described the Peleus of the Amanita muscaria, and it provided a most useful epithet for the sacred mushroom to the New Testament myth-makers. And for kajin looks exactly like another Semitic word, meaning be gracious, source of many personal names in the Old Testament, like Kanan, Hanan, Hanun, Kanu, Hana, and Yahweh has been gracious. John, Greek for Ionas, and so on. Thus, seeking Semitic personal names for their characters in the Gospel stories, the writers had in these gracious Old Testament names a rich store from which to choose. We have thus an Anna and Annas, and several Johns, and the color reference of the latter name is particularly clear in the case of John, the brother of James, the Boanerges. The name James is, of course, the English representation of Jacob, Greek Iochbus, and Hebrew Yaakov, whose brother in the Old Testament story is Esau, the red-skinned one, and the counterpart of the New Testament, John. It is better known, John the Baptist. The color reference is also prominent. The myth makers have simply added to the name the Semitic epithet tabal, the sea-ipper, baptizer, or dyer, derived ultimately from the same Sumerian mushroom that gave Akkadian its tabaru, red dye, in Latin its tablion, purple fringe, just mentioned. The name and title of John the Baptist in the New Testament story, then, means no more than the red-topped mushroom, but in giving him the added fungus name, Bali, the storytellers were able to assign him an important role in the story as the baptizer of Jesus and others. And in the added descriptions and stories of this desert prophet in the Gospels, further mushroom names and epithets were played upon. Now John wore a garment of camel's hair. The prophet's description is modeled, of course, on that of Elijah, the Old Testament prophet, who wore a garment of haircloth. But the New Testament writer's addition that the hair came from a camel is an interesting illustration of the way he and his fellow exegetes adapt the ancient traditions to fit their purposes. The point of camel here is that the Hebrew name for the animal, Kerkara, formed a useful word play or pun on the Greek name for the mandrake, Kerkaya. In fact, we may now trace back both words to a common Sumerian root, Kerker, a name of the holy plant. It means two cones. And applied to the mushroom, it denoted the two halves of the vulva, like tab bali above, and to the camel, the double hump, and his food was locusts and wild honey. The locusts, part of the prophet's diet, has given biblical naturalists much trouble. There were, of course, edible locusts known in those times, but popular tradition fancied the carob as the most likely reference of the text. And today, the Serotonia siliqua is known as St. John's bread. Unfortunately, this carob is not a desert plant, so discussion on the identity of the locust has continued unabated. In fact, it now seems much more likely that the source of the reference is another wordplay between the Semitic gobe, guba, edible locust, and gab-ah, mushroom. The similarity is not accidental. Both come from a Sumerian root, gug, pod, the locust reference being to the larva of the insect, the mushrooms to the vulva from which it develops, and even the popular designation of the carob as St. John's bread is not all that removed from the truth. And since the carob, as we have seen, shared at least in ancient Akkadian the same name as the mushroom, no story in the New Testament has so gripped the imagination of authors, artists, opera librettists, and others than that of the death of John the Baptist at the instigation of a jealous woman. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. For Herod had sent and seized John, and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he had married her. For John said to Herod, It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And Herodias had a grudge against him, and wanted to kill him. But she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and kept him safe. And when he heard him, he was much perplexed, and yet he heard him, knowing that he was knowing gladly. But an opportunity came when Herod on his birthday gave a banquet for his courtiers and officers and the leading men of Galilee. And for when Herodias' daughter came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, Ask me whatever you wish, and I will grant it. And he vowed to her, Whatever you ask me, I will give it, even half of my kingdom. And she went out and said to her mother, What shall I ask? And she said, The head of John the Baptizer. And she came in immediately with haste to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And the king was exceedingly sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he did not want to break his word to her. And immediately the king sent a soldier of the guard and gave orders to bring his head. He went and beheaded him in the prison, and brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. The whole story is woven from names of the sacred mushroom. The most obvious wordplay is between the Baptist's name, Tabala, the platter, Latin tabula, borrowed as tabid into Semitic, and the mushroom, tabali. But other, more subtle punning has provided most of the details, such as the banquet for the men of Galilee, the offer of gifts unto half my kingdom, the prophet being bound in prison, and so on. The daughter of Herodias, or the little heron, as the name means, is a piece of mushroom nomenclature, as is the use of the name Herod itself throughout the story. And here, as elsewhere, real-life characters feature in the story, otherwise quite fictional, largely because their names lent themselves to easy punning on mushroom names or epithets. Red and white. It is the deep red of the canopy of the Amanita muscaria that first attracts attention, but closer examination shows that the red background is flecked with white, the wart, like remains of the vulva adhering to the cap. The flaky nature of the white particles also contributed to mushroom nomenclature and folklore. And in the Sowl's story, for example, it was not only the redness of his skin that marked him off from his smooth brother Jacob, but the roughness of its texture, an allusion to the scabby CP of the mushroom, and in the vision of the Amanita muscaria that must now seem the most likely reference of the first chapter of the book of Revelation. The mystic, being in the spirit, as he says, saw this white flecking of the shining sun, like face of the mushroom, as white wool. And I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet saying, "Write what you see in a book." Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me. And on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed with the long robe, and with a golden girdle round his breast. His head and his hair were white as wool, white as snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined as in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and from his mouth issued a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. Such a distinctive and striking appearance as that presented by the cap of the Amanita muscaria gives us a great advantage in our search for old mushroom names. But it leads us into a strange place and into comparisons with the most unlikely objects, animals, plants, and even gems, which, apart from their color characteristics, have little to do with the mushroom. This is largely why the mythology and symbolism of the sacred fungus has managed to keep its secrets for so long. The panther. In the Jewish Talmud, Jesus is sometimes referred to as Bar Pandurge, son of the panther. Most fanciful ideas were expressed about someone called Panther, whose relations with the Blessed Virgin and paternity of the babe were the subject of much rich speculation by the Jews of later times, and to the annoyance of the Christians. But the epithet has remained a mystery and has survived even the zealous activities of the Christian censors, largely because its relevance had been forgotten. We can now see that it is, in fact, a descriptive title of the sacred mushroom, the Semitic word being a transliteration of the Greek panther, our panther. The reference is to the keen markings of the animal's coat, described by Pliny as Sinai, spots like eyes on a light ground. The ancient botanists must have used the name of the animal for the fungus, just as today the near relative of the Amanita muscaria, Amanita pantherma, is so named among modern mycologists. References to the Christian Jesus figure occur but sporadically in old Jewish traditions, for it is here that the Christian censors, who came to control most of the libraries of the civilized world, have understandably been most active. Where the name does occur, it is often attached to epithets or incidents whose significance has been lost. These now need a thorough re-examination, for the Pandera references shown conclusively that the early Jews were all well aware of the original mushroom nature of the Christian cult, even though later, though persecution and the passage of time, this knowledge was lost or at least no longer expressed in literary form. In the New Testament, a straight pun is made on the descriptive title of the fungus, when one of the red cap figures, Annas, is said to have been the father-in-law, Greek Pentherios, of Caiaphas. This piece of information is unsupportable from historical sources, and probably quite untrue. It is merely one item in a grouping of mushroom epithets, which include also the title of the high priest, Caiaphas, properly overer, but used in the New Testament along with Peter's surname, Cephas, as a play on the mushroom word Latin cepa. We are now able to trace the origin and thus basic meaning of the Greek panther. It comes from the Sumerian bar, skin, and the word we met before with the meaning red wool, dara. Another use of dara is with the significance of spotted, variegated in color, and so bar dara will have meant spotted, variegated skin, and came dialectically into Greek as panther, as a descriptive title of the peculiarly marked animal. And in Hebrew, this same original phrase can now be recognized behind its word for the gum betulica, Latin Bedlium. The Old Testament includes it among the sources of comparison when it describes the heaven sent manna of the wilderness. The manna, as we have already noted, is to be understood as the mushroom, and the reference to Bedlium is due to the appearance of that gum, containing, as Pliny says, a number of white spots, like fingernails. The opal, or Paidrios, the beloved. The same derivation and appearance leads us into the realm of precious stones in our search for mushroom epithets. The stone, opal, Latin opalus, is probably related through its distinctive coloring with the mushroom, whose name it bears, and the Greeks called the stone Paidarios. And again we turn to Pliny for an early description of this gem. The defects of the opal are a color tending towards that of the flower of the plant called heliotrope, or of rock crystal, or hail, as well as the occurrence of salt-like specks, or rough places or dots which distract the eye. The dominant color of the Paidrios is a mixture of sky blue and purple, and those in which the brilliance is darkened by the color of wine are superior to those in which it is diluted with a watery tint. The name Paidrios is also given to a thorn, acanthos, with a reddish root and a head like Thycerus, penis, and to a vegetable dye of purple color. A point of special interest in the name is that Pliny assumes that it comes from the Greek pious, paidios, boy, son, and eritos, beloved, and that it is related to the Greek paidarists, boy, lover, usually in the bad sense of our pederast. He says the stone earned its name through being exceptionally beautiful. The New Testament, apparently recognizing the specific mushroom application of the name, meaning red and white spotted skin, plays upon this understanding of Paidrios on a number of occasions. For example, when Jesus is being baptized by John in the Jordan, a voice from heaven calls out, "This is my son, the beloved." Precisely, the paius erotis, false etymology of Paidirios, displayed by Pliny in his description of the opal. Similarly, taking son as meaning disciple, the New Testament myth makers offer us the cryptic epithet, so long the subject of speculation, the disciple whom Jesus loved, that is, the beloved son, pius erotos, Paidarios. A particularly interesting example of this epithet appears in the story of the Last Supper. When Jesus had thus spoken, he was troubled in spirit and testified, saying, "Truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. And one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved, was lying in Jesus' bosom. So Simon Peter beckoned to him and said, "Tell us who it is of whom he speaks." So, lying thus in Jesus' bosom, he said to him, "Lord, who is it?" And Jesus answered, "It is he to whom I shall give this morsel when I have dipped it." So when he had dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. And here again we have the dipping theme derived from a play on the mushroom name, tab-ba-li, and the Semitic root tabal, dip, dye. The words, the disciple whom Jesus loved, the Paidrios, red and white spotted skin, continue the color allusions of the passage. The scabby one, and lapis lazuli, the characteristic peeling, scabby aspect of the Amanita muscaria is also reflected in its nomenclature and mythology. The Arabs call the mushroom the scabby one, and it is probably this feature of the sacred fungus to which Isaiah refers when he warns the daughters of Zion, engaged in witchcraft, that the Lord will make your crown scabby and denude your vulva. and the prophet seems to be alluding to the scabby one they were adoring in their cult, and the reference is probably the same when he has Yahweh complain to Israel that he had planted her as a vine and hoped to reap justice, mishpat, but had received for his pains only fungi, scabs, mispak, making a pun on the two words. And as the reader will appreciate, it is only now that we are beginning to understand the significance of the mushroom cult in the ancient world that the relevance of many such passages and allusions in the prophetic writings of the Old Testament can be understood. This is not a matter into which we can go deeply in this work, but clearly one necessity for any future study of the prophetic writings will be to try and sift out all such cultic references, and perhaps discover how far the prophetic movement in Israel was averse to the fungus cult completely, and how far the Yahwists of, say, the 8th century were merely making their stand against certain aspects of the old religion. One thing is now quite certain. The situation was never the clear-cut opposition of Yahwehism versus the old fertility cults that later Jewish and Christian theologians liked to suppose. Yahweh was himself a fertility god, and the cult of the sacred mushroom against which Isaiah in certain passages, like the ones above, seems to be railing, was but an esoteric development of that fertility religion. But to return to our scabby mushroom, as one might expect, the flaking of the surface of the Amanita muscaria, with its wart-like particles of white skin against the red of the cap, reminded the myth makers of sufferers from leprosy and other skin diseases. So we should be prepared to find in biblical stories concerned with lepers allusions to the mushroom. In the Gospels, people so afflicted are commonly mentioned. But one ulcerous character claims our special attention, mainly because of his name, Lazarus. On the face of it, Lazarus is simply a form of the Old Testament name Eleazar. But here, as so often with New Testament names, we have in approximation to a biblical name an epithet of the mushroom. What the New Testament cryptographer had in mind here in his Lazarus was the word we know in English as lazuli, usually found in conjunction with lapis, stone, to describe a blue mineral containing flecks of gold. And as Pliny describes it, adding that it can be tinged with purple, our name lazuli comes from the Persian Lazherward, and we can now trace it back, ultimately from a Sumerian phrase, Arzai-Dara, brightly shining, variegated stone. The Persian form is simply a jumbled form of the Sumerian, and from it Semitic derived its Lazrad, on which form the New Testament word play with Lazarus was made. And to the writer of the Gospel, the significance of the name lay in the speckled purplish color of the Amanita muscaria, to which, in his description of the unfortunate beggar, he added the scabby ulcerous appearance given by the warty surface of the cap. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. Barnabas, son of consolation. The reference to lapis lazuli furthermore opens up to us a line of approach which helps us solve another intriguing problem of New Testament nomenclature. The proper Sumerian name of the mineral is za-jin, flecked stone. These words came into Semitic in a variety of forms. The consonants underwent various dialectical changes en route, and they became jumbled out of their original positions. However, it is usually possible to pick out the new forms now that the phonetic correspondences can be recognized. And in Hebrew, for instance, the ZGN of the Sumerian became SPR, giving sapir, lapis lazuli, and the same form is found in the Greek sapphirios, our sapphire, usually attached to quite another stone. From our more immediate point of view, a more interesting development was to produce the group NBS. Thus, Akkadian had Nabjesu, red-dyed wool, and in Aramaic, Nabusa is the name of a certain red woolly caterpillar that infects the service tree, Sorbus domestica, and the motif of red flecked with white continues in the Greek and Latin names of the giraffe, Nabuus, which Pliny describes as an animal with a neck like a horse, and the feet and legs of an ox, a head like a camel, and is of ruddy color picked out with white spots, which is a good description of the coloration of the Amanita muscaria. It is, as we now see, the same NBS verbal group that is the significant part of the name of the New Testament character, Joseph, called Barnabas. Now the company of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one said that any of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had everything in common. There was not a needy person among them, for as many were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the proceeds of what was sold and laid it at the apostles' feet, and distribution was made to each as any had need. Thus Joseph, who was surnamed by the apostles Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, a Levite, a native of Cyprus, sold a field which belonged to him, and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. The surname of this philanthropist has caused the commentators much trouble in the past. For the New Testament cryptographer has given us another of his pseudo-translations, telling us that Barnabas means son of encouragement. He implies thereby that the first part, bar, is the Aramaic son of, and that the nabis at the end represents another Semitic word meaning encouragement. In point of fact, there is no extant root which offers that meaning and which looks like nabas. The name is not, indeed, Aramaic at all, and the first element is the Sumerian bar, skin, and the second is our giraffe, red with white spots, word, the whole being yet another epithet of the Amanita muscaria. The pseudo-translation, son of encouragement, refers not to Barnabas, but comes from a wordplay we have already met, between the roots we, in, gracious encouragement, and KHNN, red, our red cap. The writer points the way to the decipherment himself when he says that Barnabas was a native of Cyprus, Kuprios. He and his readers were well aware that the Greek word for the red dye, henna, is kupros, and the Hebrew kopher, Aramaic kufer. The similarity which made the word play here possible is not, as we can now appreciate, pure coincidental. Both go back to an original Sumerian gu bar, top of the head, glans, penis. In the case of the offshore island, the reference is to the old fertility geography of the area, which saw the island as the tip of the penis awaiting entry into the groin of the mainland. The dye, henna, kufra, gave a color which seemed to the ancients to resemble the suffused red of the glans penis. Even the philanthropist's first name, Joseph, had probably a similar reference in the mythmaker's mind. The name means, as we have seen, Yahweh, semen, penis, from Sumerian, Ayuu Sipa Sib. Cognate with this is the name of the precious stone we now know as jasper, the Greek iaspis, Hebrew iagesthia, all deriving from a Sumerian iasipasib, penis, stone, again referring to the color of the glands. The point of the story itself, the sale of the field and donation of its value, is another allusion to the Akeldama theme of the Issachariot story. It will be remembered that the storyteller played an played it in that instance on the idea that the miscreant's blood money was used to buy a field, which because of its associations became known as the Field of Blood. And as we shall see, wordplay there is between the Aramaic dimj, blood, and dj me, price, value, and between akal, food, and kakal, field. The real relevance of the name Akeldama was food of compensation or atonement, being equivalent to other names of the holy plant, which referred to it as God's atoning sacrifice made to the earth on man's behalf, the price of salvation. So, in the story of Barnabas's gift from the proceeds of the sale of his field, the theme is the same, giving us a name of the sacred fungus, together with an appetition to its Akeldama title and cultic significance. Joseph's coat of many colors. Our work enables us now to open up a major new line of approach to the patriarchal myths in the Old Testament. But on a smaller scale, it also helps us to solve a number of niggling points of Hebrew philology, which, although not important in themselves, have served to remind us continually of our ignorance of so much early Semitic vocabulary. And one such problem was the description of the tunic given to a more famous Joseph by his adoring father, Jacob, Israel. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other children, and because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors, or, as our modern translations have it, a long robe with sleeves. The older understanding of the nature of the tunic came from the early Greek translators who received a tradition that the rare Hebrew word passum meant many-colored, spotted, and more recent translators have favored an alternative rendering which described not the color of the garment, but its shape and size. They have seen in passum a word meaning palms of the hands, so that somewhat improbably, the description implied that the sleeves of the tunic reached to the palms. Hence their long robe with sleeves. Happily, thanks to the prompting of the Barnabas decipherment, we can make a fresh assessment of the rare Hebrew word, finding in it a root cognate with the latter part of Barnabas, his name, and meaning red spotted with white, or, as a related Aramaic word denotes, freckled. The Greek translators of Genesis are thus vindicated, and we traditionalists can cling on to our coat of many colors. To conclude, it is hardly surprising that the worshippers of the sacred fungus found it in its distinctive coloring and surface texture a rich source of a material for descriptive epithets and folk tales. Our modern fairy tale writers are no less attracted by the red-topped toadstool that decorates the covers of so many children's books. The classic story of the golden fleece has come from the woolly nature of the mushroom cap, as its ancients envisaged it, and old words for dyeing red have their original reference to the Amanita muscaria. And in the New Testament, the myth makers seized upon the similarity between the Semitic word for red cap to name a number of the characteristics, including John the Baptist. The Jews have managed to preserve a name for Jesus, the panther, or spotted skin, which shows that at first, anyway, the real significance of the Christian myth and cult was not lost to their contemporaries. Decipherment of the name of the ulcerous Lazarus has led the way to appreciating for the first time the nature and meaning of the New Testament cryptographer's son of encouragement, applied as a pseudo-translation to the color epithet of the sacred fungus, Barnabas. And one of the effects claimed for the hallucinatory drugs in the cap of the Amanita muscaria is that the subject sees objects in colors, larger and brighter than life. Applied to the mushroom itself, the prime example of such drug-inspired vision is to be found at the beginning of the revelation to John, noticed on a number of occasions. But as we can now appreciate, this enlarged view of the object of their adoration had long before given the ancients a major source for their cosmographies, accounts of the beginnings of the world. They saw the whole universe as a monster mushroom, the earth as the lower cup of the vulva, the heavens stretched out above as a great pileus, supported on a pillar of some sacred mountain. Out of this conception came stories of giants holding up the canopy of heaven, and another source of folk names and mythology of the mushroom. Furthermore, we can now begin to understand names given to the environs of Jerusalem and the relevance of the proximity of the Dead Sea to the fertility cults centered on that city. On a larger scale, it is possible to appreciate the derivation and significance of names of the areas bordering the eastern Mediterranean, regarded as the crutch of the earth and thus the entrance to her womb. In the beginning was the vulva. End of chapter 14. The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross.